Appalachia. My name is Phil Conn. I'm your host for this series. Today we're going to talk about mountain ballads, and almost everyone that hears of the mountains, regardless of where you're from, thinks of the ballads, the oral traditions that characterize the area. And we have with us today an authority on that topic, Mr. Loyal Jones, who is director of the Appalachian Center at Berea College, Berea, Kentucky. Mr. Jones graduated from Berea College, as I did. He also earned a master's degree at the University of North Carolina, and as a native of western North Carolina, he has a lot of insight, a lot of feel for the Southern Mountain experience from several perspectives. Really good to have you with us today, Loyal.
Nice to be here.
Loyal and I have been friends for many years. We worked together with the old Council of Southern Mountains many years ago and have shared our interest in Southern Mountain culture and traditions over the years. Loyal, you not only like to sing mountain ballads, I don't know if we're going to get any out of you today, but we might try in a minute. But more importantly, I think you've done a lot of research on where the ballads come from, their significance both historically and socially. So let's start off by letting you tell us what a mountain ballad is really, or a ballad as contrasted with a folk song or some other musical form.
All right, well, a ballad is simply a story, a narrative told in song, I guess, with a tune rather than just a tale. It's metered like poetry, and it sometimes has a nice tune, but I think the tune is less important than the story that's being told. Usually the ballad is tragic, alas. They talk about unrequited love, and sometimes such things get people into trouble and they wreak violence on one another. Sometimes it's about a tragedy, you know, something happened, an accident or something. So quite often they're tragic, although not always. Usually the ballad is in the third person. The person who's singing the song is usually not involved. He knows the story, and he's going to share the story with you. And thus, I think we need to realize that most folk singers were not performers in the sense that we think of Nashville or television performers as being performers. It didn't matter whether they had a good voice or not. They had a story, and they told it to you in song. And it was an important part of the literature of people. It's the sort of thing people brought in their heads from across the waters. And many of these ballads are from the British Isles or the continent of Europe. But the style and the tradition went on, and people kept making ballads as interesting things happened, as girls got murdered, or as people died of unrequited love, which they don't do much of anymore. But, you know, train wrecks or whatever, you know, people would make ballads, and people like to hear them. Country people, rural people, the folk, whatever, I think deal with the verities of life more than us, we sophisticated people who like to deny death and deny the baser natures, our own natures. But, you know, most ordinary people speak very frankly of these things, and they like to talk about the tragedies of others. I don't mean that they enjoy them, but we all enjoy a sense of story and of destiny and of tragedy. After all, we go watch Shakespeare, or some of us do, and what is that but the same kind of material told in another way?
You say, though, the emphasis on a ballad is on the story rather than some catchy tune.
I think so.
And I guess a lot of these ballads then are very long. In other words, they take you through quite an involved story from start to finish.
Incidentally, the ballad is known all over the world, and it might be the history of a country, and it might be in so many verses you couldn't hear it all in one sitting.
It's a way of transmitting then traditions orally, history orally. But generally when we think of a ballad, we do think of a tune, a cadence. Do we ordinarily think of rhyme?
Rhyme, usually, and there's standard rhymes, and a good ballad singer, if he should happen to forget the rhyme, would probably come up with another word that made perfect sense, that rhymed with the one that it needed to rhyme with, and he'd go right on. And that's how ballads probably got changed.
So ballads change and are embellished and modified over the years. Well, why do people think of the Southern Mountains when they think of the old traditional ballads? From whence come Southern Mountain ballads, and why do they seem to have persisted here more than in some parts of the
I
country.
think there were ballads other places in the country, Nova Scotia in Canada, of course, and there are other places in the country that were, New England had lots of ballads. But as people become more sophisticated, and as they become more literate and have libraries, and now that they have radios and television and everything, they don't depend on this kind of thing for entertainment. But I think in the southern mountains, the people have tended to be more traditional. And if you're traditional in the ways that were brought by your foreparents. And most of the people who settled the southern mountains came from the British Isles or from Germany or whatnot, and therefore they brought lore with them. From Germany and came a lot of the old folk tales we tell, but most of the ballads that we sing in English, naturally, came from the British Isles, and they may be about lords and ladies and people that are far removed from our lifestyle, but people still sing them because there's a good story there. Quite often, you know, good triangle love affairs and people slashing at each other and all that. It's high drama.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And, you know, to underscore the fact that ballads continue to be written, and certainly were all through the 20s and 30s, my granddaddy used to sing a lot of the old ballads like Barbary Ellen.
Yeah.
But I remember most vividly songs of more recent origin, I guess. He used to sing one about little Mary Fagan, who was a little girl that was killed in Atlanta area of Georgia. So I guess that ballads have been developed commercially during this century, as well as being oral tradition per se. Is that true?
Oh, yes. Well, when radio first came along in the recording industry really came along. Radio didn't get here really till 1924 when stations were actually set up and needed talent. And while we'd had cylinder recordings, the disc recordings that we think of as the recording industry also came along a little bit earlier, but in the 20s. They had a nice new medium, but not much to put on it, you know. So you either put classical music or whatever on it, or you tried to get people who already did things, who already sang, to come in. And the kind of thing that the great mass of people liked were the fiddle tunes and the ballads and that sort of thing. So whoever was in position to sing those things got the chance to do it. But it wasn't long before people started creating their own songs in order to have something new for this new medium. And as tragedies happened, people wrote songs about it, or they wrote little love songs, or modified the old folk songs. Right. And it wasn't long until this thing became commercial. First, radio wasn't commercial. They didn't really pay. The people just built a radio station to advertise or give goodwill. They didn't really advertise much.
To kind of demonstrate where we get some of the older ballads, why don't you name a few ballads and tell us where they might have come from, and maybe even give us some insight into the storyline, because I'm fascinated by this bridge between the old country and the new world that we've seen in what are called Southern Mountain Ballads.
Yeah. Well, a lot of these ballads go back to medieval times. There were some there usually had to do with a religious theme of the devil meeting a school child on the road and starting to question him. And the child is very smart, and he answers the questions and invokes God and discovers that this is really the devil and sort of ushers him back to hell. That was one of the early, and it's a riddle ballad, as if, question and answer. And then you had ballads going back to the time of the Crusades, 12th, 13th century, like Lord Bateman. It's about a crusader tied to, said to be the father of Thomas Becket, the great churchman of England, Archbishop of Canterbury, who went down and was captured by the Turks, in the Crusades, put in prison, but the Turk's daughter let him out, and they make a vow and a promise, and she follows him back to England, but he's given up on her and has brought a new bride in the day she knocks. But he throws out the new bride, takes her in. Of course, she has rings on all of her fingers and gold around her middle and everything, which probably helped. And the new bride has a tragic situation, although he gives her a little alimony, and she goes on her way. And that's one of the very early ballads, and it's not a tragic one unless you consider the bride's, new bride's position. And then you go on down to ballads like Barbary Ellen, which is best known probably in the Appalachian region, a story of unrequited love, of a girl spurning a lover. And he dies probably of a broken heart, and she ups and dies too, after telling her father and mother to make her bed and dig her grave and everything. And it's a beautiful story, almost like Romeo and Juliet, you know, and that's one of the early ones. Both of these would have come out of England, I think, but a ballad like Edward, how come this blood on your shirt sleeve, the mother asked the son, and he said, oh, it's the old horse, no, it's too red. Well, it's my old hound, no, it's too red. And then he confesses he's killed his brother-in-law, and he has to set his foot in a bottomless ship, which means he ain't coming back.
Right, right.
And that would be a Scottish ballad, I think. Normally you would think of that. And ballads like Lord Randall, who comes home sick and his mother keeps questioning him, another riddle ballad, finds out his girlfriend has poisoned him with eels and milk. You know, you don't eat fish and milk together. That's a superstition. Right. It'll poison you. There are lots of ballads. That's probably a Scottish or English ballad. These were known throughout the British Isles, I think.
I know a lot of ballads seem to refer to the royalty of the British Isles. And I have heard that Froggy Went A-Courtin', which sounds like a kiddie song, is actually a satire on certain characters in the English royal family. Do you know anything about the origins of that?
I've heard that. That Elizabeth of England, Elizabeth I of England, had a French boyfriend at one time. So Froggy was the Frenchman, and it was one way maybe they could make a little fun.
And Black Jack Davy supposedly has to do with some scoundrel, you know, who took away a noble lady.
That's right. He's a fellow, so they say, named Johnny Faa, F-A-A, and there was such a gypsy who ran off with, you know, we have superstitions today. If the gypsies are around, you watch your women and you watch your horses and you watch your chickens. These are long-standing things and have come out of a ballad like that, which is very old, you know.
Were some of the old ballads, though, religious songs, and by that I mean literally songs of worship, or were most ballads more along secular things?
They were secular. Some of those very early ones, like The Devil and The Schoolchild, might have had a religious meaning. Right. But the strange thing about these ballads is that they are almost amoral, because the singer of the ballad doesn't pass judgment on whether they did right or wrong. He usually, or she just narrates this and tells you what happened, like a newspaper might. And in fact, they did serve the place of the newspaper, in place of a newspaper. And it just goes right down to the climax, and they die and they're buried. Now, they might say they're buried in the old churchyard, and out of his grave grew a red, red rose in the case of Barbary Allen, and out of hers a briar because she was the bad person. Sometimes that's reversed if the man is the bad person, like Lord Lovell, who rode off and let his girl die of a broken heart while he's out wandering around the world. But they always climb to the old church tower and unite in a true lover's knot, which is a wonderful symbol. And I suppose that has a message, but no comment on it. Just they tell you the story. Now later, American ballads that have been composed recently, with the influence of the revivals and everything, you will get a little moralistic message at the end usually.
Of course, we have a whole group of oral traditions, folk tales, like the Jack Tales, to name one group of stories, and they seem to have developed along different lines, or have they ever been sung? How much interplay is there between what you call a ballad and a folk tale?
I think these are two separate, mediums, if you would have it that way. Some people sang and would love the ballads. Other people had a flair for telling tales. They say Southerners in general, and I think mountaineers in particular, are good at narrating some event, which may not have much to it, but in the telling becomes, quite an interesting thing. So I think this is two ways of giving a narrative of great exploits, of tasks. Usually the tale has a different kind of ending to it. They're tragic in that they slay giants and witches and all that, but usually Jack or Mutzmeg, whoever the hero or heroine are, they come out all right and marry the king's girl or king's boy and live happily ever after. Whereas the ballad tends to be more tragic and come to a conclusion that leaves one feeling somewhat melancholy.
Of course, a lot of the old-time balladeers from the Southern Mountains are dying out. I think we owe a real debt to some of the collectors of these ballads in that they have been preserved, at least they've been recorded. Tell us about some of the individuals who combed the Southern Mountains and recorded either actually on sound recordings or at least recorded on musical scores these ballads. And along with that, you might tell us of some of the old balladeers that have had some renown.
Of course, you know, a lot of people would disagree that you can somehow collect and preserve, that once it's written down. There was a Mrs. Hogg told Sir Walter Scott, when he wrote down her ballad, she said, it'll never be the same. You know, and in a sense,
the essence of it just by writing.
I suppose with videotape you can come closest to preserving how a performer did something. But I think we do owe a great debt to people like Catherine Jackson French, who came through here and sort of out of Berea College collected a great number of ballads. Josiah Combs in Knott County, who later published the folk songs of Southern United States in French. He got a PhD at the Sorbonne and did his work on Southern Mountain Ballads, one of the first Appalachian scholars, certainly. And people like Cecil Sharp, whom Mrs. John C. Campbell, who had collected some ballads, had told that, well, there are people down here still sing these old ballads that he had said in about 1910 were dead in London or around England.
And he was an Englishman.
He was an Englishman, a musicologist, and he thought the ballad had died out, but it didn't occur to him that there might be English-speaking people elsewhere in the world still singing these old traditional ballads. So he came to this country and collected a 2-volume work called English folk songs from the Southern Mountains. At the same time, you had natives like Bascom Lamar Lunsford of North Carolina who was collecting and building a tremendous memory collection of some 318 or 20 ballads and tales and songs and hymns and so forth, which he performed and which he recorded for the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress under Robert W. Gordon in 1927 established an archive of folk song, which also collected folk tales and whatnot. And many people, Artis Moser of North Carolina, many other people collected for that. And there were other people like Mellinger Henry and Dorothy Scarborough, outsiders who came here to collect songs, and Gordon himself. And their own wire recordings and wax cylinders and aluminum discs and later, you know, vinyl at the Library of Congress. And those are a tremendous reservoir. But at Duke University, the friends of Frank C. Brown, an early collector in North Carolina, put together the magnificent 7-volume Frank C. Brown collection of North Carolina folklore, and Vance Randolph in the Ozarks put together his 4-volume collection of Ozark folk songs and many other volumes of folk tales and that sort of thing. There were many people who've done it, and we owe a great debt to them. I think a lot of us are continuing to do this. We have an archive of Appalachian recorded music at Berea, the Library of Congress, Indiana University, University of North Carolina, and various other places.
Are there still a lot of what you would consider to be traditional balladeers in the Southern Mountains? Are there people yet to be recorded and yet to be studied?
I think ballad scholarship is probably gone mostly as far as it can go. We can't add a whole lot more to it. We can discover new singers. There are a lot of old singers who have not been invited to sing here, who do sing these, and I know a lot of old people who sing as well as any ever sang. Unfortunately, there are not, I think, enough of the young people right out of that tradition continuing, but there are a lot of other young people who have rediscovered this tradition and who are relearning it, maybe not even of this tradition, but they're important too, and I applaud the work of anybody who advances this whole area of folklore, because I think it's important to people. It says something about the human condition.
Of course, we have 2 trains of thought, and I want to kind of throw these at you because they seem to be at loggerheads, and see what you make of them. You have described the ballad as something that's alive and vital and can be modified and embellished, and new ones can be written, and a new tragedy brings a new ballad. That sounds like a living medium. And it sounds like almost anybody can buy into it. But then we have the other point of view that when you speak of oral traditions and the old-timey ballads, pure and uncontaminated, that somehow modern impact or some breakdown in the chain of oral pass-it-on destroys the essence of the ballad. So how do you come down on this whole notion of whether there is a pure, uncontaminated ballad, and whether, on the other hand, that a ballad is what you want it to be and express it the way you wish, and you can be considered a balladeer?
Well, I think that there probably never was an uncontaminated ballad. I know some people who grew up in a very rural setting who learned these ballads from their forebears who sang for Cecil Sharp in 1916, 17, and 18, but they own a copy of Cecil Sharp. So if they have any problem with the lyrics, they can go to that book. I know they do that. And why shouldn't they?
Right.
You know, and a lot of these people learn from the radio or from recordings, and now Library of Congress. You know, there's
impossible now not to be influenced.
There's an old joke about, where did you learn this? Well, I learned it from my grandmother, who learned it from my aunt, who learned it from a Joan Baez record. That's an old joke. You know, but that's literally it, and we have to make use. We can more carefully collect a ballad with a cassette recorder than we could with just the ear or being able to notate if we could. I think everything's changing. Tradition is always in process, and I would not exclude anyone. I do think, however, that it's important to consider folk material in context. It used to be people would collect a ballad, and they were interested only in the ballad. Look at this pearl I found. It's such a beautiful thing. They didn't care a whit who sang that or out of what experience it was sung. And I think that that is, oh, I don't know. It's like assuming you know something about agriculture from picking a dewberry, you know,
right.
or a raspberry, you know. There's a lot more to it.
Yeah, the setting and what undergirds about it is very important.
Well, of course, and I do think that these people who come out of a particular tradition, let's just say Jean Ritchie, when Jean Ritchie does a concert, it's not that she's just singing you some songs. She is allowing you to enter in upon a way of life, and it's a cultural trip, you know. And there's a whole lot of difference between that and somebody from somewhere who came down and learned 6 good ballads and puts on a show and sings well and picks the guitar banjo well. I think there's more to it than that, and we ought to be concerned about the total cultural setting, the milieu that these songs came out of.
You're really saying, I guess, that in experiencing a ballad, it's not enough to experience the music in a superficial way. It's best if you can literally experience the heritage, the culture, the whole frame of reference that is being represented.
I think so. Everybody really needs, I tell my students, one time you ought to find somebody, some venerable older person who knows a tale or an anecdote or a ballad, and sit there and spend a day with them and get acquainted with them and know about them and hear this ballad or this tale or this anecdote and try to place it in context and try to determine what this means in terms of values, in terms of a way of life, and in terms of the sentiment of the people who have perpetuated it and who are passing it on to you.
Let's talk a while about accompaniment. Now, of course, with pop, country, and folk music, the accompaniment, you know, the musicians and their renditions on instruments overpowers the lyric oftentimes. But traditionally, did balladeers use instruments, and what instruments did they use and how?
Cecil Sharp reported that not only one person accompanied the ballad with an instrument, I think, but my opinion is he didn't ask them to. He said, do you know an English ballad? They sang him an English ballad. Mountain people are modest folks. They didn't run and say, you ought to hear me pick the banjo. They just didn't do that. I think there were both, but many of the balladeers were the older women or the old men who may have sung while they were churning or shucking corn or plowing in the fields. You hear all the time, oh, I remember him well. I used to hear him. You could hear him a mile when he was plowing his corn, singing ballads. But on the other hand, there were other types of songs, the banjo tunes, the old shouting songs, as Lily May Ledford calls them, where you know, Fly Around My Pretty Little Miss or Little Birdie or Cindy or something like that. The people would pick the banjo a while and sing a while, pick the banjo or keep, you know, and it was an accompaniment. The guitar, everybody likes to think the guitar is a standard instrument in the mountains. Really, that came in after the turn of this century, and the mail order house had a great deal to do with distributing the guitars. The banjo would have been a standard instrument, the dulcimer in some places, but the dulcimer was by no means a standard instrument through the mountains. The fiddle was brought into the mountains because it's small and you could carry it with you, but it was used for dancing or just playing.
A lot of it was more up-tempo music, and most ballads don't move to a rapid beat.
No, they're very slow, and they're like some of the church hymns. And quite often, we haven't said anything about the modes. A lot of the ballads are in the old modes that some people call minor modes. They may or may not have been minor, but they didn't just go do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, and come to rest on do like the diatonic scale. They might have started on re, for example, or la, and ended on la, and this gave a sort of an unsettled feeling. Also,
that's where you get what's called a haunting sound.
The haunting sound. They were also, many of them, 5-tone. They didn't have the 7 tones in the regular scale. They'd be 5 or 6. You know, they called gap scales, which meant the half steps were gone, or one of them would be gone. And therefore, you had a haunting sound. A lot of people have talked about the melancholy nature of the ballads and have blamed us for being too sad or melancholy. But part of it is the nature of the tune you're singing. I say, why not be melancholy if you feel melancholy?
If you're singing about a tragedy, you might as well be melancholy.
Well, Keats wrote an ode to melancholy, and nobody thought anything about that. But somehow we're blamed for being too morbid by singing ballads. But Buell Kazee, a famous singer, said that it serves a purpose. It's a catharsis. If we feel sad, we can sing a ballad and feel better.
Right. Loyal, thank you very much. It's been an absolutely super discussion. We could get into many more aspects of ballads and other types of folk music, but I thank you for being our guest, and I ask all of you to join us again for another segment of Our Appalachia, and we will try to share with you our heritage and our culture.